Seeing as how Welch was our new home, Brian and I figured we'd make the best of it. Dad had shown us the spot near the house where we were going to put the foundation and basement for the glass castle. He'd measured it off and marked it with stakes and string. Since Dad was hardly ever home, he was out making contacts and investigating the UMW, he told us, and never got around to breaking ground. Brian and I decided to help. We found a shovel and pickaxe at an abandoned farm and spent just about every free minute digging a hole. We knew we had to dig it big and deep. No point in building a good house unless you put down the right foundation. Dad always said it was hard work, but after a month we dug a hole deep enough for us to disappear in. Even though we hadn't squared the edges or smoothed the floor, we were still pretty darn proud of ourselves. Once Dad had poured the foundation, we could help him on the frame. But since we couldn't afford to pay the town's trash collection fee, our garbage was really piling up. One day Dad told us to dump it in the hole. But that's for the glass castle. I said, it's a temporary measure. Dad told me. He explained that he was going to hire a truck to cart the garbage to the dump all at once. But he never got around to that, either, and as Brian and I watched, the hole for the glass castle's foundation slowly filled with garbage. Around that time, probably because of all the garbage, a big, nasty-looking river rat took up residence at 93 Little Hobart Street. I first saw him in the sugar bowl. This rat was too big to fit into an ordinary sugar bowl, but since Mom had a powerful sweet tooth, putting at least 8 teaspoons in a cup of tea, we kept our sugar in a punch bowl on the kitchen table. This rat was not just eating the sugar. He was bathing in it, wallowing in it, positively luxuriating in it, his flickering tail hanging over the side of the bowl, flinging sugar across the table. When I saw him, I froze, then backed out of the kitchen. I told Brian, and we opened the kitchen door cautiously. The rat had climbed out of the sugar bowl and leapt up onto the stove. We could see his teeth marks on the pile of potatoes, our dinner, on a plate on the stove. Brian threw the cast iron skillet at the rat. It hit him and clanged on the floor. But instead of fleeing, the rat hissed at us, as if we were the intruders. We ran out of the kitchen, slammed the door, and stuffed rags in the gap beneath it. That night Maureen, who was 5, was too terrified to sleep. She kept on saying that the rat was coming to get her. She could hear it creeping nearer and nearer. I told her to stop being such a wuss. I really do hear the rat. She said, I think he's close to me. I told her she was letting fear get the best of her, and since this was one of those times that we had electricity, I turned on the light to prove it. There, crouched on Maureen's lavender blanket, a few inches away from her face, was the rat. She screamed and pushed off her covers, and the rat jumped to the floor. I got a broom and tried to hit the rat with the handle. But it dodged me. Brian grabbed a baseball bat, and we maneuvered it, hissing and snapping, into a corner. Our dog, Tinkle, the part Jack Russell Terrier who had followed Brian home one day, caught the rat in his jaws and banged it on the floor until it was dead. When Mom ran into the room, Tinkle was strutting around, all pumped up like the proud beast slayer that he was. Mom said she felt a little sorry for the rat. Rats need to eat, too. She pointed out, even though it was dead, it deserved a name, she went on, so she christened it Rufus. Brian, who had read that primitive warriors placed the body parts of their victims on stakes to scare off their enemies, hung Rufus by the tail from a poplar tree in front of our house the next morning. That afternoon we heard the sound of gunshots. Mr. Freeman, who lived next door, had seen the rat hanging upside down. Rufus was so big, Mr. Freeman thought he was a possum, went and got his hunting rifle, and blew him clean away. There was nothing left of Rufus but a mangled piece of tail. After the Rufus incident, I slept with a baseball bat in my bed. Brian slept with a machete in his. Maureen could barely sleep at all. She kept dreaming that she was being eaten by rats, and she used every excuse she could to spend the night at friends' houses. Mom and Dad shrugged off the Rufus incident. They told us that we had done battle with fiercer adversaries in the past, and we would again someday. What are we going to do about the garbage pit? I asked. It's almost filled up. Enlarge it, Mom said. We can't keep dumping garbage out there. I said. What are people going to think? Life's too short to worry about what other people think. Mom said. Anyway, they should accept us for who we are. I was convinced that people might be more accepting of us if we made an effort to improve the way 93 Little Hobart Street looked. There were plenty of things we could do, I felt, that would cost almost nothing. Some people around Welch cut tires into 2 semicircles, painted them white, and used them as edging for their gardens. Maybe we couldn't afford to build the glass castle quite yet, but certainly we could put painted tires around our front yard to spruce it up. It would make us fit in a little bit. I pleaded with Mom. It sure would, Mom said. But when it came to Welch, she had no interest in fitting in. I'd rather have a yard filled with genuine garbage than with trashy lawn ornaments. I kept looking for other ways to make improvements. One day Dad brought home a 5-gallon can of house paint left over from some job he'd worked on. The next morning I pried the can open. It was nearly full of bright yellow paint. Dad had brought some paintbrushes home, too. A layer of yellow paint, I realized, would completely transform our dingy gray house. It would look, at least from the outside, almost like the houses other people lived in. I was so excited by the prospect of living in a perky yellow home that I could barely sleep that night. I got up early the next day and tied my hair back, ready to begin the house painting. If we all work together, we can get it done in a day or two, I told everyone. But Dad said 93 Little Hobart Street was such a dump that we shouldn't waste time or energy on it, that we could be devoting to the glass castle. Mom said she thought bright yellow houses were tacky. Brian and Lori said we didn't have the ladders and scaffolding we needed. Dad was making no visible progress on the glass castle, and I knew that the can of yellow paint would sit on the porch unless I undertook the job myself. I'd borrow a ladder or make one, I decided. I was certain that, once everyone saw the amazing transformation of the house begin, they'd all join in. Out on the porch, I opened the can and stirred the paint with a stick, blending in the oil that had risen to the surface until the paint, which was the color of buttercups, had turned creamy. I dipped in a fat brush and spread the paint along the old clapboard siding in long, smooth strokes. It went on bright and glossy and looked even better than I had hoped. I started on the far side of the porch, around the door that went into the kitchen. In a few hours, I had covered everything that could be reached from the porch. Parts of the front were still unpainted, and so were the sides, but I had used less than a quarter of the paint. If everyone else helped, we could paint all the areas I couldn't reach, and in no time we would have a cheerful yellow house. But neither Mom nor Dad nor Brian nor Lori nor Maureen was impressed. So part of the front of the house is yellow now. Lori said, "That's really going to turn things around for us." I was going to have to finish the job myself. I tried to make a ladder from bits of scrap wood, but it kept collapsing whenever I put my weight on it. I was still trying to build a sturdy ladder when, during a cold snap a few days later, my can of paint froze solid. When it got warm enough for the paint to thaw, I opened the can. During the freeze, the chemicals had separated and the once smooth liquid was as lumpy and runny as curdled milk. I stirred it as hard as I could and kept stirring even after I knew the paint was ruined, because I also knew that we'd never get more, and instead of a freshly painted yellow house, or even a dingy gray one, we now had a weird-looking half-finished patch job, one that announced to the world that the people inside the house wanted to fix it up but lacked the gumption to get the work done. Little Hobart Street led up into one of those hollows so deep and narrow that people joked you had to pipe in the sunlight. The neighborhood did have lots of kids. Maureen had real friends for the first time, and we all tended to hang out at the National Guard Armory. At the foot of the hill, the boys played tackle football on the training field. Most of the girls my age spent their afternoons sitting on the brick wall surrounding the armory, combing their hair and touching up their lip gloss and pretending to get all indignant but secretly loving it if a crew-cut reservist wolf whistled at them. One of the girls, Cindy Thompson, made a special effort to befriend me, but it turned out that what she really wanted was to recruit me for the Junior Ku Klux Klan. Neither putting on makeup nor wearing a sheet had much appeal for me. So I played football with the boys, who would waive their guys-only rule and let me join a team if they were short a player. The better-off folk of Welch had not exactly flocked to our part of town. A few miners lived along the street, but most of the grown-ups didn't work at all. Some of the moms had no husbands, and some of the dads had black lung. The rest were either too distracted by their troubles or just plain unmotivated, so pretty much everyone grudgingly accepted some form of public aid. Although we were the poorest family on Little Hobart Street, Mom and Dad never applied for welfare or food stamps. And they always refused charity. When teachers gave us bags of clothes from church drives, Mom made us take them back. We can take care of our own, Mom and Dad liked to say. We don't accept handouts from anyone. If things got tight, Mom kept reminding us that some of the other kids on Little Hobart Street had it tougher than we did. The 12 Grady kids had no dad. He'd either died in a mine cave-in or run off with a whore, depending on whom you listened to, and their mom spent her days in bed suffering from migraines. As a result, the Grady boys ran completely wild. It was hard to tell them apart, because they all wore blue jeans and torn t-shirts and had their heads shaved bald to keep away lice. When the oldest boy found their dad's old pump-action shotgun under their mom's bed, he decided to get in some target practice on Brian and me, firing buckshot at us as we ran for our lives through the woods. And then there were the Halls. All 6 of the Hall children had been born mentally retarded, and although they were now middle-aged, they all still lived at home with their mom and dad. When I was friendly to the oldest, Kenny Hall, who was 42, he developed a powerful crush on me. The other kids in the neighborhood teased Kenny by telling him that if he gave them $1 or stripped down to his skivvies and showed them his wanker, they'd arrange for me to go on a date with him. On a Saturday night, if he'd been set up like that, he'd come stand on the street in front of our house, sobbing and hollering about me not keeping our date, and I'd have to go down and explain to him that the other kids had played a trick on him and that, although he did have many admirable qualities, I had a policy against dating older men. The family who had it the toughest on Little Hobart Street, I would have to say, was the Pastors. The mother, Ginny Sue Pastor, was the town whore. Ginny Sue Pastor was 33 years old and had 8 daughters and 1 son. Their names all ended with Y. Her husband, Clarence Pastor, had black lung and sat on the front porch of their huge, sagging house all day long, but he never smiled or waved at passers-by. Just sat there like he was frozen. Everyone in town said he'd been impotent for years and none of the Pastor kids was his. Ginny Sue Pastor pretty much kept to herself. At first I wondered if she lay around in a lacy negligee all day, smoking cigarettes and waiting for gentlemen callers. Back in Battle Mountain, the women lounging on the front porch of the Green Lantern, I'd long since figured out what they really did. Wore white lipstick and black mascara and partially unbuttoned blouses that showed the tops of their brassieres. But Ginny Sue Pastor didn't look like a whore. She was a blousy woman with dyed yellow hair, and from time to time we saw her out in the front yard, chopping wood or filling a scuttle from the coal pile. She usually wore the same kinds of aprons and canvas farm coats worn by the rest of the women on Little Hobart Street. She looked like any other mom. I also wondered how she did her whoring with all those kids to look after. One night I saw a car pull up in front of the Pastor house and blink its headlights twice. After a minute, Ginny Sue came running out the door and climbed into the front seat. Then the car drove off. Kathy was Ginny Sue Pastor's oldest daughter. The other kids treated her like a total pariah, crowing that her mother was a whore, and calling her lice girl. Truth was, she did have a pretty advanced case of head lice. She kept trying to befriend me. One afternoon on the way home from school, when I told her we'd lived for a while in California, she lit up. She said her mama had always wanted to go there. She asked if maybe I'd come over to her place and tell her mama all about life in California. Of course I went. I'd never gotten inside the Green Lantern, but now I'd get an up-close look at a genuine prostitute. There were lots of things I wanted to know. Was whoring easy money? Was it ever any fun, or was it just gross? Did Kathy and her sisters and her father all know Ginny Sue Pastor was a whore? What did they think of it? I didn't plan on flat out asking these questions, but I did think that by getting inside the Pastor's house and meeting Ginny Sue, I'd come away with some idea of the answers. Clarence Pastor, sitting on the porch, ignored Kathy and me as we walked by. Inside, there were all these tiny rooms connected together, like boxcars. Because of the way the house was settling on the eroding hillside, the floors and ceilings and windows tilted at different angles. There were no paintings on the walls, but the pastors had taped up pictures of smartly dressed women torn from Sears Roebuck catalogs. Kathy's little sisters scampered around noisily, half-dressed. None of them looked alike. One was redheaded, one a blonde, one had black hair. And there were all different shades of brown. Sweet Man, the youngest, crawled along the living room floor, sucking on a fat dill pickle. Ginny Sue Pastor sat at the table in the kitchen. At her elbow was the carcass of a big expensive roaster, the kind we could hardly ever afford. She had a tired, lined face, but her smile was cheerful and open. "Pleased to meet you," she said to me, wiping her hands on her shirt tail. "We ain't used to getting visitors." Ginny Sue offered us seats at the table. She had heavy breasts that swayed when she moved, and her blonde hair was dark at the roots. "You all help me with this bird, and I'll fix you a couple of Ginny Sue's special chicken rolls." She turned to me. "You know how to pick a chicken clean." "I sure do," I said. I hadn't had anything to eat all day. "Well, show me, then," Ginny Sue said. I went for a wing first, pulling apart the spindly double bones and getting all the meat trapped there. Then I set to work on the leg and thigh bones, snapping them at the joints and peeling off the tendons and digging out the marrow. Kathy and Ginny Sue were also working on the bird, but soon they stopped to watch me. From the tail, I pulled that nice piece of meat that everybody misses. I turned the carcass upside down and scraped off the jellied fat and meat flecks with my fingernails. I stuck my arm elbow deep into the bird to excavate any meat clinging to the rib cage. Girl, Ginny Sue said. In all my days, I have never seen no one pick a chicken clean like you. I held up the spear-shaped cartilage in the breastbone, which most people don't eat, and bit down with a satisfying crunch. Ginny Sue scraped the meat into a bowl, mixed it with mayonnaise and cheese whiz, then crushed a handful of potato chips and added them. She spread the mixture onto 2 slices of Wonder Bread, then rolled each slice into a cylinder and passed them to us. Birds in a blanket, she said. They tasted great. Mama, Jeanette lived in California. Kathy said. That's so. Ginny Sue said. Live in California and be a stewardess, that was my dream. She sighed. Never got beyond Bluefield. I told her and Kathy about life in California. It quickly became clear they had no interest in desert mining towns, so I told them about San Francisco and then about Las Vegas, which wasn't exactly in California. But they didn't seem to care. I made the days we had spent there seem like years, and the showgirls I'd seen from a distance seem like close friends and neighbors. I described the glittering casinos and the glamorous high rollers, the palm trees and the swimming pools, the hotels with ice-cold air conditioning and the restaurants where hostesses with long white gloves lit flaming desserts. It don't get no better than that. Ginny Sue said. No, ma'am, it sure don't. I told her. Sweet man came in crying, and Ginny Sue picked him up and let him suck some mayonnaise off her finger. You did good on that bird. Quote, Ginny Sue told me, you strike me as the kind of girl who's one day going to be eating roast chicken and those on-fire desserts just as much as you want. She winked. It was only on the way home that I realized I hadn't gotten answers to any of my questions. While I was sitting there talking to Ginny Sue, I'd even forgotten she was a whore. One thing about whoring, it put a chicken on the table.